Have you ever paused to wonder if a major global power, a country whose currency basically props up the world economy like the United States could actually, well, go broke,
That's a heavy question.
right? And if it did, what would that even look like for you, for your savings, for, well, everything?
It's definitely not just some abstract thought experiment. The answers really will hit home for everyone, impacting our well-being and the choices we all make.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're looking into the frameworks of Ray Dalio, the legendary global macro investor.
Yeah, his new book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, just came out.
Exactly. And he gives us this powerful lens, to understand these big economic shifts that often seem to come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So our mission today is really to unpack his big cycle template. Dalio himself calls it invaluable for making sense of what's happening right now. It shows how history kind of rhymes, right? And what that all means for money, debt, and the whole global power balance.
And what makes Dalio's perspective so compelling, I think, is that he's not coming at this like a pure academic.
Right. He's been in the trenches.
Exactly. Over 50 years navigating these cycles as an investor, he had to put actual money behind these ideas. And it's backed up by some serious historical digging over 100 years in depth, and even looking back 500 years superficially.
Wow.
Plus, he's bounced these ideas off top policymakers, people like Larry Summers, Timothy Geithner, Mario Draghi. So this isn't just ivory tower theory. It's battle-tested understanding.
Okay, so let's peel back the layers. Where does Dalio start? What's the engine of the economy, according to him?
Well, he really focuses on credit. He argues it's the main way spending gets funded, and crucially, it's incredibly easy to create.
Easy to create. Walk us through that logic.
Okay, so when credit flows easily, one person's spending immediately becomes someone else's income, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
So that naturally boosts overall spending, incomes shoot up, asset prices inflate, and, in the short term, who doesn't love that?
Everyone's happy.
Exactly. But here's the catch, the inherent tension. Creating credit today feels great, but it also creates debt that has to be repaid down the line.
The payback.
And that repayment does the exact opposite. It forces less spending, pulls down incomes, deflates asset prices.
So it's this constant push and pull, the immediate sugar rush versus the eventual bill coming due.
Precisely.
And Dalio stresses this, right? Those everyday ups and downs we see, the recessions and booms, they aren't just random events. He sees them as smaller waves building into this huge, often unseen, big debt cycle.
That's the one.
The one that really shapes our long-term financial reality. He talks about short-term debt cycles, maybe averaging, 6 years or so?
Yeah, about that.
And how they slowly accumulate over decades to form this massive big debt cycle, typically lasting around 80 years, much longer.
He uses a really vivid analogy for this. He compares it to, eating fatty foods. Cholesterol builds up slowly, silently. You don't feel the danger day to day.
Until bang, heart attack.
Exactly. The long-term risk of all this debt piling up often gets ignored because the short-term problems don't seem that serious.
Okay, and Dalio also has a different take on price, doesn't he? It's not the usual supply and demand curves you see in textbooks.
No, he keeps it very practical, very direct. For him, price is simply the total amount of money being spent divided by the total quantity of stuff being sold.
Total dollars over total quantity. Price equals total Q. Simple.
Pretty much. Think about a farmer's market example. If suddenly everyone gets a bunch more cash to spend, but the number of tomatoes for sale stays the same.
Tomato prices are going up.
Right. Dalio's focus is really on understanding the motivations behind why the big buyers and sellers are acting. If you get why they're buying or selling, you can make pretty good predictions about their actions and therefore where prices are headed.
And he argues that if the rate of buying or selling becomes unsustainable,
then prices become unsustainable and the whole economic situation gets shaky.
okay, that makes intuitive sense. So who are these key players? Whose motivations do we need to track?
Dalio highlights 5 main groups driving these cycles. You've got your borrower debtors, obviously, then the lender creditors on the other side, financial intermediaries, think banks, and then the big ones, central banks and central governments.
And this is where that conflict comes in again, right?
Yeah.
What's good for the borrower isn't always good for the lender.
Absolutely. Low interest rates. Great if you're borrowing money.
Terrible if you're trying to live off the interest from your savings.
Exactly. That inherent conflict of interest creates this constant push and pull within the system. It shapes policy debates, market movements, everything.
And underlying all this, there's a fundamental rule he keeps coming back to.
Yeah, a core principle. Debts just cannot sustainably keep rising faster than the income needed to pay them back. It sounds obvious, but it's often ignored.
And interest rates play a key role, too.
Critically, rates can't stay too high for borrowers for too long, or they default. But they also can't stay too low for lenders for too long, or they won't lend. Pushing either too far creates a crisis. Watching those ratios, debt to income, interest rate levels relative to growth, is crucial for gauging the cycle's health.
Okay, so we have the mechanics, the players, the core tension. How does Dalio describe the actual progression of this cycle? How do we go from healthy to, well, potentially broken?
Well, in the early stages, things look pretty good. You've got a healthy economy, finances seem sound. Interestingly, he notes that risky assets, like stocks, tend to be relatively cheap.
Why is that?
Because the memory of the last crisis, the last bust, is still fresh in people's minds. They're cautious. He points to the late 1940s, early 50s as an example. Stock earnings yields were like 4 times what bonds were yielding.
Meaning stocks looked incredibly cheap compared to bonds.
Exactly. Huge expected returns from stocks relative to safer bonds. It signaled a time of, perceived low risk and great value in equities. It's that kind of quiet before things potentially heat up.
And that quiet period, that health, often leads straight into the next phase, the bubble phase.
Almost inevitably, yes. The symptoms start to appear. Debt starts growing faster than income again. Debt service costs creep up. Asset prices get really high compared to their likely future cash flows.
Right.
And you see the creation of what Dalio calls imagined wealth. Think those unicorn companies valued at billions, but maybe only raise $50 million.
That rings a bell. He has a specific indicator for this, right? A bubble indicator.
He does, yeah. He uses it to try and spot these periods objectively.
Okay, so the bubble forms, then what? This leads us to the really painful part, the death spiral of deleveraging.
Yeah, this is where things can unravel quickly. When creditors, the lenders, start losing faith, maybe in a government's ability to pay, they start selling that government's debt.
Which forces interest rates up or forces the central bank to step in.
Yeah. Selling the debt tightens money conditions, the economy weakens, the currency comes under pressure, foreign exchange reserves might start falling. It becomes this nasty self-reinforcing loop.
More selling leads to higher rates or more money printing.
Which just makes creditors even more nervous, so they sell more. It's a spiral.
What do governments typically do then?
Well, initially they often try austerity. Cut spending, maybe raise taxes. But Dalio points out this often backfires in a deleveraging.
How so?
Because cutting spending shrinks the economy, which can actually make the debt-to-income ratio look worse.
Ah, okay. So austerity can be counterproductive then.
In that specific phase, yes. So the shift inevitably happens towards debt restructurings, basically, admitting you can't pay it all back, and aggressive debt monetization, which is the central bank printing money to buy the debt.
And this can lead to that situation known as pushing on a string.
Exactly, a classic phrase from the 1930s depression. Central banks try to stimulate, they lower rates, pump in money, but it doesn't work. People and businesses are too scared or too indebted to borrow or spend. They just hoard the cash.
Even if interest rates are zero or negative.
Even then. And that environment breeds deflation, falling prices, and really weak economic growth. Very hard to get out of.
And when those standard tools just aren't working anymore, Dalio says governments turn to policies that seemed unimaginable before.
That's his term. And history backs it up. You might see extraordinary taxes pop up. He mentions historical examples where top income tax rates or inheritance taxes jumped by around 10% during severe crises.
Wow. What else?
Capital controls basically rules to stop money from fleeing the country. Or even, in extreme cases, selectively freezing or seizing assets, particularly those belonging to perceived enemy countries, and sometimes creating entirely new forms of money.
He's not saying these will happen now, but that these are the kinds of things that have happened historically when countries get into deep trouble.
Precisely. It's about understanding the playbook, the range of possibilities based on past cycles.
This really highlights his framework for monetary policy evolution, doesn't it? How central banks are forced to adapt.
Absolutely. He lays out a clear progression. First, there was MP0, hard money. Think gold standard systems, like Bretton Woods after World War II. Eventually, they break down because growing debt runs up against the limits of the hard money supply.
Like the U.S. running out of gold in 1971.
Exactly. That led to MP1, fiat, interest rate-driven policy. That was the main tool in the U.S. from '71 up to the 2008 crisis. But it stops working when interest rates hit 0%.
Can't cut rates below zero, effectively.
Right. And when private demand for borrowing dries up, that forced the move to MP2, fiat debt monetization, or quantitative easing, QE.
Which we saw from 2008 to around 2020 in the U.S., central banks buying government bonds directly.
Yeah. Good for financial asset prices, definitely helped stabilize things. But Dalio notes it tends to disproportionately help people who already own assets. It's not great at getting money directly to the people who are struggling the most.
Which then leads potentially to MP3.
MP3. Coordinated fiscal and monetary policy. This is where you see large government deficits, big spending programs or tax cuts being directly financed by the central bank printing money, the kind of thing we saw globally after the 2020 pandemic hit.
And this happens when MP1 and MP2 aren't cutting it anymore.
Yeah, and when there's a sense that the existing system, maybe capitalism itself, isn't delivering enough for the broad population. It's a major shift. And the key takeaway from all these shifts, Dalio argues, is that as debt burdens become overwhelming, the response ultimately involves a devaluation of money and debt. The value of money goes down.
Okay, that's a huge point. But Dalio's framework is even broader than just the debt cycle, right? He talks about an overall big cycle.
He does. The debt credit money economic dynamic we've been focusing on is just one of 5 major forces he identifies.
Okay, what are the other 4?
Second is internal conflict. This captures things like widening wealth gaps, growing differences in values, political polarization getting extreme, the rise of populism on both the left and the right.
And he sees the U.S. currently.
He describes the internal conflict level in the U.S. as among the most severe historically. And he warns that historically, when democracies become too divided and gridlocked, there's often a shift towards more autocratic forms of governing just to get things done.
A sobering thought. What's the third force?
International conflict. This is about the rise of unilateralism countries going it alone, the decline of international cooperation and organizations, and escalating conflicts between major powers.
Like the U.S. and China tensions over trade, technology, potentially military issues.
Exactly. The fourth force is acts of nature. Think pandemics like COVID-19 or the increasing impacts of climate change. Big external shocks.
And the fifth?
Human inventiveness or technology, AI, quantum computing, robotics, gene editing, these transformative advances.
Which sound like positives.
They absolutely can be. They create enormous wealth, drive progress. But Dalio points out they also contribute to speculative bubbles and busts. And critically, advanced technology is now deeply intertwined with military power, which ramps up those international rivalries.
And the key is that these 5 forces don't operate in isolation.
Not at all. They interact constantly. Sometimes they reinforce each other, creating perfect storms, as he calls them. Other times they might counteract each other. But understanding how they weave together is crucial. History rhymes, he says, because these fundamental forces are timeless and universal.
Can you give us some historical examples he uses to illustrate these cycles playing out?
Sure. A quick one is the UK after World War II, around 1945. They were massively indebted from the war, had a huge empire that was becoming unsustainable.
Right.
So what did they do? Manage currency devaluations. They devalued the pound by 30% in 1949, and there were others later. It was a way to effectively reduce the real burden of their debts and help reset their economy. Classic managed devaluation playbook.
And the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, you mentioned Nixon closing the gold window.
Yeah, that's a huge one. The U.S. basically ran out of the gold needed to back the dollars held by foreign countries. It was a breakdown of that MP0 hard currency system.
And the consequence?
It freed the Federal Reserve to print money without being constrained by gold reserves. The dollar was devalued significantly, about 40% over time, and it unleashed a wave of inflation in the 70s.
Who won and who lost there?
Debtors won because the real value of their debts shrank. Creditors lost because the money they got paid back was worth less. Dalio says this was a really formative experience for him as a young investor.
What did it teach him?
The core lesson. When central banks crank up the printing presses and create a lot of money, the value of that money goes down, and the price of other things, assets, goods, services, tends to go up. A fundamental rule he's used ever since.
Okay, so those are examples of managing, perhaps painfully, through a devaluation. What about an example of what not to do?
Japan's lost decades, roughly 1990 to 2013, is Dalio's prime cautionary tale.
What went wrong there?
Several things. A major one was their failure to decisively restructure bad debts after their massive bubble burst. They kind of kicked the can down the road. Plus, rigid employment policies made adjustments harder. Interest rates, while low, weren't low enough compared to their deflation and weak growth. And they were too slow and hesitant with debt monetization, with QE.
And the result was stagnation.
Pretty much.
Um,
Almost 2 decades of grinding deflation and near zero growth. Dalio uses a stark statistic. The typical Japanese worker's monthly pay stayed flat in yen, but because of the yen's fall and deflation elsewhere, it actually dropped significantly in US dollar or gold terms, maybe from around $3,500 down to $2,500.
Ouch. So people were worse off even if their yen paycheck looked the same.
Effectively, yes. It really only started to turn around in 2013 when Bank of Japan Governor Kuroda and Prime Minister Abe launched the aggressive Three Arrows policy.
Much involved.
Massive money printing, much more government spending, and structural economic reforms. It shows how painful and prolonged a deleveraging can be if it's not managed proactively and aggressively enough.
And what about China now? How does Dalio see its cycle?
He touches on China's big cycle, starting from, say, 1949. He notes the rapid debt buildup they've had, the widening wealth gaps emerging, their increased assertiveness internationally, and he emphasizes that Chinese leaders view all of this through a very long historical lens, especially that century of humiliation narrative.
So their past heavily influences their present actions.
Deeply. And Dalia's current assessment, as of the book's writing, is that China is grappling with a significant debt problem, alongside rising internal political tensions, intensifying conflict with the U.S., major climate change challenges, and being in the thick of a technology war.
It really sounds like a convergence of all five forces for them right now.
That's exactly how he framed it, a complex and potentially volatile mix.
Okay, so bringing it right up to the present day, say March 2025 perspective from the book, where does Dalio see major countries like the U.S. and their cycles?
His assessment then was that most major countries, including the U.S., were maybe about 2/3 of the way through their current short-term debt cycles, kind of approaching an equilibrium point.
Like the long-term picture.
That's where the concern lies. He flags the long-term debt risk for the U.S. government and the Fed as being higher than ever before, mainly because of the huge amount of government debt the Fed now holds on its balance sheet, and the fact that the Fed itself has been running operating losses. He says it's manageable for now, but the underlying risk is elevated.
And fundamentally, his core message remains that the current path is unsustainable.
Yes. The fact that borrowing and debt are still growing faster than income just cannot continue indefinitely. He's very clear on that.
And the implication is that governments will eventually have to break promises.
That's the hard reality he presents. To deal with the imbalance, they'll inevitably use some combination of tactics, finding ways to raise more money or credit, forcing debt reductions through restructuring or inflation, or restricting the movement of hard money like gold or maybe even certain digital assets.
So, given that diagnosis, does he offer any prescription, particularly for the U.S.?
He does. He proposes what he calls a 3% three-part solution aimed at stabilizing U.S. government debt.
Okay, what's the goal?
The goal is to cut the annual deficit by 3% of GDP. That would bring the total deficit down to around 3% of GDP, which he sees as a sustainable level. He calculates this could reduce the national debt by trillions of dollars over a 10 to 20-year period and prevent the government from, well, going broke.
And how would that 3% cut be achieved? What are the three parts?
He suggests roughly equal adjustments from 3 areas. First, about a 4% cut in government spending across the board. Second, about a 4% increase in taxes, again, spread broadly. And third, engineering about a 1% cut in real interest rates, that's rates after inflation.
Okay, spending cuts, tax hikes, lower real rates, how quickly?
He suggests phasing it in over 3 years. And crucially, he argues for doing it now or when the book was written, while the economy is relatively okay. It's a countercyclical approach, fix the roof while the sun is shining, basically.
Right, don't wait for the crisis.
Exactly. He also stresses that for this to work without tanking the economy, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy would need to be stimulative enough to offset the drag from the government's belt-tightening. It requires coordination to balance public and private sector finances.
And his view is that this kind of plan would actually be good for markets.
Yes. He believes it would make U.S. government bonds safer, which would likely have positive knock-on effects for other markets like stocks. His biggest worry isn't the lack of a technical solution, it's the political gridlock. The lack of will among policymakers to compromise and actually implement something workable, even though, in his view, a path exists.
He also tackles that idea of American exceptionalism, doesn't he? The belief that the U.S. is somehow immune to these historical cycles.
He does. He acknowledges the real strengths the U.S. has: incredible innovation, deep and well-developed capital markets, a strong legal system, rule of law. But he quickly pivots to the underlying weaknesses: growing gaps in education quality, productivity slowdowns in certain areas, massive wealth and income inequality, and deep divisions over core values. He puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that the bottom 60% of the population economically are not doing well. He calls it a multi-generational problem.
In his point there is fundamental stability.
Yes. His core argument is that any system, any country, must deliver reasonably adequate conditions for the majority of its people. If it fails to do that for too long, it becomes inherently unstable and vulnerable to that internal conflict force we talked about.
So wrapping things up, Dalio leaves us with a pretty stark warning based on his analysis around early 2025.
Yeah, he stated he saw a significant risk, maybe not a certainty, but a significant risk of a damaging debt squeeze happening at the same time as an economic downturn, perhaps hitting 2 or 3 years from that point. So maybe around 2027, 2028.
And he has that interesting principle about worry.
Right. If you're not worried, you need to worry. And if you're worried, you don't need to worry. His point is that constructive worry prompts you to understand the risks and take action to prepare and protect yourself. Complacency is the real danger. If you're aware and taking prudent steps, you've mitigated some of the need for acute anxiety.
It really underscores why his big cycle framework is so valuable. It's not about predicting the future with certainty, but about providing a map, a way to understand the forces at play and navigate the turbulence.
Absolutely. It gives you a lens to interpret the confusing headlines and events we see every day.
So the final thought to leave our listeners with. Dalio's work strongly suggests these big cycles, these 5 forces, are indeed timeless and universal. They keep recurring. But maybe the specific outcome for us right now isn't totally set in stone.
There's still agency. How leaders and populations respond matters.
Exactly. Yeah. So considering everything we've unpacked today, these huge forces, the patterns of history, the challenges clearly visible, maybe the question for you, listener, is what steps could you start thinking about or taking to prepare for what might be some profound changes ahead? Especially knowing, as Dalio implies, that maybe the greatest force of all is simply how people choose to deal with each other through these challenges.
A powerful question to ponder.
And if you want to explore Dalio's thinking further, we definitely recommend his books, particularly Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises and Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, alongside this latest one. They really build out this framework in detail.